In a library in Paris, held behind glass in a climate-controlled case, there is a manuscript that ends in the middle of a sentence. The parchment is pale, and the ink is dark, and the hand that wrote it moved with the particular steadiness of someone who had copied text many times before and knew the value of an even line. The words proceed across the vellum in Old French, in a verse form called the octosyllabic couplet, 2 rhyming lines of 8 syllables each, thousands of them in sequence, the story they carry accumulating slowly across the page. And then, somewhere near what the scholars number as line 4485, the text stops, not because the story ends, because the vellum ends. A damage, a cut, a loss that happened in some century between the poem's composition and the present moment, in circumstances nobody has recovered. The final line does not conclude. It simply ceases, mid-utterance, the way a voice ceases when a door is closed across it from outside. This manuscript is the single surviving copy of Beyrul's verse romance of Tristan. There is no other. What exists, exists here, in this one incomplete fragment. What was cut away is gone. The poem it preserves was composed somewhere between the years 1150 and 1190, most likely by a poet working in the Norman literary tradition, a man whose name appears once inside the text itself in a brief authorial aside and nowhere else in any record that has survived. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France holds the manuscript now, and the scholars who study it have given the surviving lines their number, have compared the text against other versions of the legend for the passages that must once have appeared between the gaps, and have assembled what can be assembled from what remains. What remains is enough to constitute a major work of medieval literature. What was lost is estimated by those same scholars to have been substantially longer than what survives. The poem that exists is an incomplete version of a longer poem that existed, and the longer poem was itself one version among several of a story much older than any of them. It is worth sitting with that structure for a moment, not because it is distressing, but because it is genuinely interesting. There is a poem inside a story, inside a tradition, and each layer is older than the one it contains. The manuscript in Paris is the innermost thing, the most recent and the most fragile, the one that came closest to being entirely lost. Beneath it, the poem of which it is a fragment. Beneath the poem, the narrative tradition that the poem was drawing on, which was already several centuries old when Beyrul began to write. And beneath the narrative tradition, something even older, names, fragments, a historical residue, the faint marks left on stone and in king lists by real people who may have been the seeds of characters. The poets eventually grew into Tristan and Isolde and Mark. The name Tristan itself is one of those seeds. Among the king lists of the Picts, that ancient people of Scotland whose culture left behind carved stones, metalwork, and a sequence of royal names that Irish annalists recorded with imperfect but recognizable accuracy, there appears in entries that scholars date to approximately the 8th century, the name Drust, sometimes written Drosten, carried by a king identified in the lists as Drust, son of Talorg. The Pictish naming tradition was not the same as the Old French one, and the sound that 8th century mouth made when it said Drust would not have sounded precisely like the sound a Norman poet made when he wrote Tristan 6 centuries later. But the root is the same root. The transformation from Drust to Tristan is the kind of transformation that names undergo across languages and centuries, wearing smooth in some places and accreting in others, the original vowels shifting under pressure from the sounds around them. Scholars who have traced this path have found it convincing enough to accept as the probable derivation. The hero of one of the greatest love stories of the medieval world carries inside his name the worn residue of a historical Pictish king's name, preserved across 13 centuries of retelling like a stone, found at the bottom of a river, still recognizably itself. That Pictish king, the real Drust son of Talorg, was almost certainly not a figure of any legend during his own lifetime. He was a ruler. He held territory. His name was recorded in lists alongside other rulers in sequences that modern scholars interpret as genuine historical records, imperfect and incomplete, but rooted in memory of actual people. The story that eventually gathered around his name, or around the name his name became, was not there when he was alive. It came later. It gathered gradually, the way stories gather around the names of figures who hold some quality that communities need to think about across generations. A young man of great skill and courage, a king's nephew, a woman betrothed to one man and bound in some other way to another. The specific nature of that binding and all the events that led to it would come with time. The name was there first, worn down from Drust to Tantrist to Tristrant to Tristan across the centuries and the languages, and the story grew up around it like a tree around a standing stone. That stone, a literal stone, not a metaphor for one, still stands in a landscape that may be the landscape of the legend's earliest location. It is a carved Pictish memorial stone somewhere in Scotland, worn at its edges by weather accumulated across more than 1,000 years, set into low hills under a gray sky that changes its quality of light several times a day without ever becoming warm. The letters carved into it include the name that scholars read as Drust. They were cut by someone who expected the stone to last, and it has. The man commemorated by those letters is not the man who became Tristan. He is the man whose name became a name that became a story that became one of the most widely distributed literary legends of the European Middle Ages. Between the real Drust and the fictional Tristan, there is a great distance of time and transformation, and that distance is interesting in itself, worth tracing even where it cannot be fully traced, worth noting even where it disappears into periods of silence. Eilhard von Oberge was a German poet, working most likely somewhere between 1170 and 1190 in the world of the small courts that dotted the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, patrons wanting entertainment and prestige in the sense that their halls participated in the great literary culture that Norman and Angevin poets were producing to the west. His version of the legend is called Tristan, which is the form the name takes in Middle Low German, the language he was working in, and Eilhardt's Tristan has a distinction that the other early versions of the legend lack. It survives complete. The poem is whole. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and all of them are present in the manuscripts that preserve it. When scholars want to understand what the full narrative arc of the early Tristan tradition looked like, before the damage and the loss that reduced other versions to fragments, it is often to Eilhardt's Tristan that they turn, reading his complete German text as a kind of structural guide to what the French and Anglo-Norman poems must once have contained. Imagine that poem being copied in a German scriptorium, a monastic writing room, narrow windows, cold light falling on rows of angled desks, a scribe whose job it was to reproduce exactly what lay before him on the exemplar without adding and without subtracting. The quill moves across the vellum with the slow, deliberate pressure of someone who understands that the text in front of them will outlast the room they sit in. Outside the narrow window, rain falls steadily on the stone buildings of the monastery, on the vegetable gardens enclosed by low walls, on the road that runs toward the nearest town, and then beyond it, toward all the other towns and courts and libraries of the empire. Inside, the story moves from one piece of vellum to another, surviving one more winter inside its new skin of animal hide. The words that Eilhart composed are carried forward into another generation's hands, and then from those hands into another pair, and from those into another, until the manuscripts that a modern scholar examines are separated from the original composition by 6 or 7 centuries of copying and storage, and preservation and occasional near loss. The survival of any medieval manuscript is looked at closely, a story of near misses. The vellum could have been scraped clean and reused for something else. This happened constantly, the expensive material of older texts being recycled for new ones, the original words fading under the new layer of ink. The binding could have failed in a damp storage room, the leaves scattering and losing their sequence. A fire could have taken the library, a flood, a military campaign, the ordinary entropy of objects left to weather without anyone's attention. That Eilhart's Tristan survives complete is not remarkable in the sense of being mysterious. It is remarkable in the sense that survival required a very long series of small decisions, to keep this, to copy that, to store it here rather than there, and any one of them failing would have changed what exists. The manuscript in Paris that ends mid-sentence is the record of one such decision failing, somewhere, at some point in the chain. The German poem that survives whole is the record of the chain holding. Thomas of Britain composed his version of the legend, most likely in the court of King Henry II of England, which was one of the great literary courts of the 12th century, a place where Anglo-Norman French was the prestige language of poetry, where a skilled court poet could find patronage and an audience, where the legends of Celtic Britain were being taken up and reshaped for a courtly readership that wanted something more refined and more psychologically complex than the older oral traditions had given them. Thomas was that kind of poet. Scholars who have studied the fragments of his text that survive have generally characterized him as the more sophisticated of the early Tristan poets, more interested in the inner lives of his characters, more attentive to the moral and theological questions that the story raised, more willing to slow the narrative down in order to examine what a particular moment meant to the people living inside it. His text survives in 8 fragments, 8 separate pieces of what was once a much longer poem, totaling roughly 3,144 lines of what Thomas's complete poem must originally have been, a number that represents a fraction of the whole, the fraction whose vellum happened to survive, whose libraries happened not to burn. The 8 fragments are held in different collections across Europe now, separated by geography and by the accidents of preservation history. And scholars who work on Thomas's Tristan work with these scattered pieces the way a restorer works with a damaged mosaic, placing each fragment in relation to the others, inferring from their edges what must have lain between them. The mosaic, even incomplete, is beautiful. The inference required to fill its gaps is itself a kind of scholarly composition, a careful act of listening to what the surviving lines imply about the lines no longer present. What these poets were drawing on, Beyrul, Eilhart, Thomas, and the others, was already old when they wrote it down. The story circulating through the courts of 12th century Europe had been circulating somewhere, in some form, before the courts of 12th century Europe existed. The specific mechanism of that transmission is not fully recoverable. There was an oral tradition before there were manuscripts, and oral traditions leave their traces not in documents, but in structures, in the shapes of stories, in the particular arrangement of plot elements that recur across different versions composed in different places by people who had no direct access to one another's texts. When two stories from different cultures have the same structure, not similar themes in a general way, but the same specific sequence of events, the same relationships between characters, the same emotional and narrative logic, the probability of independent invention is low. Something was shared, something moved. The Irish tale of Diarmaid and Grain is one of those structurally parallel stories. It belongs to a body of Irish heroic literature known as the Fenian Cycle, in which the great warrior band of Fionn mac Cumhal and his companions appear in a long series of tales that were composed and refined across many centuries. The tale of Diarmaid and Grain is among the most widely known within that tradition. In it, a young warrior of exceptional beauty and skill, Diarmaid, a member of Fionn's band, is placed in an impossible position when the woman who has been promised to his lord and leader, a king's daughter named Grain, chooses him instead. Grain places a geis, a magical obligation, a binding compulsion that in Irish tradition carries the weight of both law and supernatural force, upon Diarmaid, requiring him to flee with her. He cannot refuse a geis. The binding is real, and it is not voluntary, and so they run. Diarmaid and Grain run together through the hills and forests of Ireland, pursued by Fionn and his warriors across a landscape that the tale names precisely, mountain by mountain and river by river, the geography of Ireland becoming the geography of the story. They sleep in different places every night. They leave markers of their passage, fires, cut branches, arranged stones that Fionn reads as he follows them. They are never entirely safe and never entirely without shelter. The pursuit goes on for years. The land they cross becomes the land the story belongs to, every place name in the tale doubling as a memory of their passage, the landscape permanently marked by the event of their flight. The structural parallel with the Tristan legend is precise enough that most scholars who have examined both traditions accept a shared or borrowed narrative foundation between them. A young man of exceptional ability, a woman promised to a powerful older ruler, a binding between the young man and the woman that is in some sense involuntary, or at least not straightforwardly chosen, a pursuit by the king across a landscape, years of flight and hiding, the older man's love for both of them running alongside his sense of betrayal so that his response is never simply rage. The specific arrangement of these elements, not the general theme of a love triangle, which appears in countless stories, but the specific distribution of agency and compulsion and pursuit and mercy, is the kind of structural fingerprint that does not arise twice by chance. One tradition influenced the other, or both were fed by something older than either. The rivers run parallel because they rise from the same ground. It is worth noting that the Irish tale, like the Tristan legend, was not composed at a single moment. It was assembled across time, pieces of it older than other pieces, the sequence of events shifting in different tellings, the relative sympathy accorded to Diarmaid and Fionn, and Grain modulating as the tradition moved through different communities and different centuries. What survives in manuscript is a version of the tale as it was written down in a particular period, but the oral tradition behind it stretches back far earlier into a time before any of the Irish literary manuscripts were compiled. The story was being told before it was being written. It was crossing the Irish Sea in some form before Norman poets were composing octosyllabic couplets in the courts of Henry II. It was alive in the spaces between languages and between islands, carried by the same traffic: traders, pilgrims, traveling poets, sailors stopping long enough to share a meal, and a story that carried everything else across the early medieval world. A traveling harper in the courts of 12th century England would have known how to give his listeners something they recognized alongside something they had not heard before. The best entertainment was always both. A story that felt entirely unfamiliar offered no foothold. A story that felt entirely familiar offered no reason to pay attention. What the Tristan legend offered its courtly audience was something in between, a narrative they could feel, in some dim way, as something they had always known, because its roots were old enough that versions of its structure had been circulating in this landscape for generations, while also presenting it in a new form, refined and psychologically specific, attentive to the kind of interior experience that the courtly audience valued and recognized as meaningful. That harper, if such a figure can be imagined, which the historical record of the period certainly permits, would have moved from hall to hall, carrying the story as a craftsman carries his tools, each performance a new assembly of familiar materials in a specific shape for a specific occasion. The verses he composed or recited would have sounded different in a stone hall in the north of England from how they sounded in a hall near the Channel. The local patrons would have had local expectations. The listeners in each hall would have brought to the story their own knowledge of the landscape it was set in, their own sense of which details rang true and which were borrowed from elsewhere. The story was not a fixed text. It was a living practice, flexible within the limits of its essential structure, shaped by the interaction between the teller and the particular room he was telling it in. This is how most of the medieval versions of the Tristan legend reached their various poets, not through a single authoritative source text, but through a network of oral performance and partial manuscript tradition, layered and inconsistent and extraordinarily generative of variation. The fact that Berule's version and Thomas's version and Eilhart's version all tell essentially the same story, while differing substantially in detail, in the length of the potion's effect, in the role of secondary characters, in the moral weight assigned to the central events, is not a sign of confusion in the tradition. It is the sign of a tradition that was genuinely alive. Stories that are truly alive change in the telling. They absorb what the moment requires and discard what the moment cannot use. The core survives because it answers something that the people telling it need to have answered. The variations around the core are the evidence of all the different moments in which it was told. The scholars who have worked on these texts over the past 2 centuries have mapped this variation with great care and considerable ingenuity, assembling comparative tables of plot elements, arguing about stemma, the hypothetical family trees of manuscript relationships, proposing and revising theories about which version depended on which source, which features were original to the tradition, and which were innovations by particular poets. Their work is careful and genuinely interesting, and ultimately inconclusive in the way that all work on this material is inconclusive, because the oral tradition that precedes the manuscripts is not recoverable in full, and the relationship between the surviving texts and the tradition behind them is a matter of inference rather than demonstration. The uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship. It is an accurate reflection of how these stories actually lived, loosely multiply in many mouths and rooms at once, with no single point of origin that can be identified and held. What can be identified and held are the physical objects the tradition left behind. The Berulle manuscript in Paris, its last line ending mid-sentence. The fragments of Thomas's poem distributed across several European collections, each piece a window into a larger poem that no longer fully exists. The complete text of Eilhart's Tristan in Middle Low German, the chain of copyists holding this time. The Tristan stone in Cornwall, its Latin inscription worn but legible across 1500 years of weather, rests the name it carries linking the legendary tradition to a historical individual through a chain of transformation that the stone itself records in its very existence as a carved memorial rather than a literary text. These objects are the points at which the tradition became solid, where the voice became ink, and the ink became parchment, and the parchment survived long enough to be placed in an archive and held, and beneath all of them, running earlier and deeper than any manuscript, the Irish hills where Diarmaid and Grain ran, ahead of Fionn's pursuing warriors, the mountain names still attached to places in the Irish landscape, the rivers still called by the names the tale gave them. The two traditions, the Irish one and the Celtic British one, from which the Tristan legend more directly grew, ran alongside each other for centuries through the same rough northern Atlantic landscape, shaped by the same kinds of communities, answering the same kinds of questions about what it means to be bound to someone against your will and what the proper response of an older, more powerful figure should be when his love and his authority are simultaneously at stake. They were parallel rivers. They had always been parallel rivers. And the source they shared was older than either of them, somewhere back in the mountains, in a time before anyone was writing anything down, in the dark of a hall where a voice was moving through a story, and the listeners were settling into the particular quiet of people who have heard something beginning that they know they need to follow all the way to its end. That story, in one form or another, has been moving from mouth to mouth, and hall to hall, and manuscript to manuscript, and library to library, since somewhere before the 8th century, gathering names and images and small precise details as it goes. The harp in the boat, the sword left between the sleeping bodies, the fragment of blade that fits exactly into the notch in a living man's sword, the sails red in the wrong color from a harbor tower, each detail added by someone who needed it to be there and left it in place for all the tellers who came after. What the barrel manuscript holds is one moment in that long movement, the moment at which the story settled briefly into those 4,485 surviving lines of Old French verse before the vellum gave out and the text fell silent and the story went on without it. The silence at the end of that manuscript is not a wound in the tradition. It is simply where the document stops and the story continues, as it has always continued, in the telling that follows from wherever the last telling ended. Somewhere in the libraries of France, the parchment holds its final line, the ink still dark against the pale surface, the words proceeding steadily up to the point where the vellum was cut, and then simply stopping, exactly the way a story stops when the light runs out and the listener has fallen asleep. The story itself does not stop. It moves on into the dark, the way stories have always moved, carried forward in the memory of everyone who has heard them, waiting for the next voice, willing to begin again from the beginning, or from wherever the telling left off. Two figures running through the dark hills of Ireland, ahead of a pursuing king, the night around them enormous, the landscape receiving their steps without judgment, mountain by mountain, river by river, the names of places accumulating into a map of a flight that happened somewhere in the deep past of a tradition that is still, here and now, in the quiet of this hour, being told again. A woman named Blanchefleur spoke a single word in the room where she was dying, and that word was the first sound her son heard in the world. The word was a name, In the old French of the tradition, it carried the root of the word for sorrow, triste, so that the child arriving into the world arrived already named for what his birth had cost. His mother had been sister to King Mark of Cornwall. She had traveled far to be with the man she loved, and in the particular accounting of the legend, that love had brought her to this room, to this cold stone floor, to this moment of both arrival and departure happening at once. She spoke the name with whatever breath remained to her, and then she was gone, and the child she left behind carried her grief encoded in the syllables of his own identity, permanently, from the first morning of his life. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment before moving on. Not the birth itself. Births are common enough in legend, but the specific act of a dying woman choosing to leave something in language, choosing that the word sorrow would be the first word her son heard, shaping his future in the only way available to her in that small remaining window of time. Whether she understood the name as a gift or a warning, or simply as the truest description she had for the experience of that hour, is not something the tradition records. What the tradition holds is the name itself, and the name is enough. It carries everything she knew of him forward into the world she was leaving. The child Tristan grew up in Mark's court in Cornwall. His early life in the legend is the life of a young man finding his place in a world built on honor and obligation, learning the skills that the court valued, moving through the expectations placed on the nephew of a king, becoming the kind of man who would one day be asked to do something that no one else would agree to do. The tradition does not linger long on this early period. What it wants to reach is the island. There was an arrangement between Cornwall and Ireland that the tradition presents as a source of ongoing humiliation. At regular intervals, Cornwall was required to send tribute across the water, not gold, not goods, but people, young men and women, taken from Cornish families and delivered to Ireland, the arrangement enforced by an Irish champion named Morholt, who arrived by ship to collect what was owed. No knight in Mark's court was willing to face him. Morholt was not a figure, a reasonable man challenged without cause to believe he could survive the encounter, and the knights of Cornwall were, whatever else they were, reasonable men. Tristan was young and had not yet accumulated the particular reasonableness that longer life brings. He volunteered. The tradition in its various versions agrees on this basic structure, that no one else stepped forward, that the humiliation of the tribute was felt by everyone in the hall, and that Tristan was the one who spoke. A combat was arranged. An island was chosen, small and offshore, far enough from either coast that there would be no help from any shore. The two men were set there with their weapons, and the tide was left to determine the outcome. The fight itself, the tradition moves through without dwelling on its details at length. What matters for the shape of the story is not how the combat proceeded blow by blow, but what it left behind. Morholt fell on that island. Tristan lived, but Morholt's blade had been poisoned, and the wound it opened in Tristan's side was the kind of wound that does not close. The physicians of Cornwall worked on it. The physicians of France were consulted. None of them had a remedy for what Morholt's weapon had deposited in Tristan's flesh, and as the weeks passed and the wound continued its slow, quiet refusal to heal, it became apparent that something would have to change. Tristan made a request. It was an unusual one, and the tradition records it with a kind of quiet matter-of-factness that is itself interesting, not presented as desperation, not as dramatic last gesture, but as a considered proposal from a man thinking clearly about his situation. He asked to be placed in a small boat. He asked that a harp be put beside him. He asked that the boat be given to the sea without oars and without a sail. and that he be allowed to go wherever the current chose to carry him, because to stay in Cornwall was to continue dying without purpose, and the sea might carry him somewhere that Cornwall could not reach. Mark agreed to this. The boat was prepared. Tristan was settled into it, with his harp propped against his side, and the shore of Cornwall receded behind him as the sea took the vessel and began its own slow navigation through the gray water of the channel. The image of that boat, small, drifting, carrying one man and one instrument into whatever the tide was willing to provide, is one of the legend's most quietly persistent images. There is no urgency to it. There is no one pursuing the boat or racing to stop it. There is only the sea doing what the sea does, and the man inside the boat doing the only thing available to him, which is to wait. The Irish coastline appeared through morning mist. Whether it was days or weeks, the tradition does not specify with any consistency, and the specific duration matters less than the direction. The boat found Ireland, which is the shore it needed to find. Tristan came ashore in a country that did not know him. The wound that could not be healed in Cornwall brought him to the one place in the known world that contained the skill to address it, though he did not know that yet when the boat grounded on Irish sand, and he lay in it, weak, his harp still propped at his side. He gave a false name. This is a detail the tradition preserves with care, because it is not simply a precaution, it is an anagram. The name he used was Tantris, which is Tristan reversed, the syllables shuffled, but intact, as if he could not bring himself to discard his own name entirely, and so carried it with him in disguise. The way a man might carry a document he cannot afford to present openly. Under the name Tantris, a harp player and traveler washed up on an Irish shore. He was brought before the court, and he was healed. The person who healed him, in the legend's accounting, was Isolde. She appears here first, not as the woman who will love him, but as the woman who possesses the knowledge required to address what is destroying him. Her mother was the source of the medical skill in the household, and what the two of them knew about wounds and remedies was practical and serious, not magical in the sense of being arbitrary, but learned, applied with care to a specific injury, in a specific man. They worked on the wound in Tristan's side. They gave it what it needed. The wound closed. He stayed long enough to recover. While he recovered, he played his harp in the court of the Irish king, and the court listened, and none of them knew that the musician's real name was the reverse of the one he was offering them. There is something in this detail that the tradition seems to want the listener to notice, that Tristan was present in Ireland, under a name that was and was not his own, hiding and not hiding at the same time. The truth of him, audible in every performance, but not legible to anyone who had not been told where to look. The harp playing was genuine. The name was the disguise. The man beneath was entirely Tristan. He returned to Cornwall. He was healed, and he was young, and the court had sent him to be healed because it valued him, and now he was back with his wound closed, and his strength returned, and the question of what to do with him arose again. The answer the tradition provides is that King Mark required a queen, that Tristan was the appropriate emissary to arrange such a thing, and that the woman who had been identified as a suitable candidate for that role was the daughter of the Irish king, the same Ireland, the same court, the same Isolde who had healed him under the name Tantris, who did not yet know what name his vessel had been given at birth. Tristan went back. This second voyage is not a convalescence. He arrives in Ireland as a knight performing a function for his king, moving through a country that knows him as a harpist and does not know him as the man who killed Morholt. The situation is layered in a way that the tradition seems to hold with calm interest rather than dramatic heightening. There is a man in Ireland who is not who he has said he is. in a court that has reasons of its own to want him identified, and the gap between what is known and what is not known is doing a great deal of work in the room every time he enters it. What broke through the second visit's relative composure was a dragon. Ireland had been troubled by a creature the tradition calls a dragon, though the word covers a range of things in medieval narrative, and the precise nature of the beast is less important than its function, which was to terrorize the Irish kingdom and to have resisted every effort to remove it. The Irish king had made the usual arrangement for such situations. The man who killed the dragon would receive the hand of his daughter. Several men had died attempting to collect on this offer. Tristan, arriving in Ireland with a different errand to perform, encountered the dragon and killed it. The proof of the kill mattered enormously. A seneschal, a court official, had found the dead creature and intended to claim the achievement as his own, presenting himself to the king with evidence of the kill and asserting the right to Isolde's hand as the reward. Tristan, understanding that the false claim was being built, had taken the precaution of cutting out the dragon's tongue before collapsing. He carried the tongue on him when he fell. He fell in the open field near the creature's body. The damp Irish grass pressed flat around him. The venomous breath that had poured from the dying dragon's throat, having done its own damage to the man who had been close enough to deliver the killing blow. Isolde found him, or rather she and her mother went looking for the truth of the dragon's death, because the seneschal's claim had not satisfied anyone who looked closely at it, and what they found in the field was Tristan, unconscious, carrying a dragon's tongue wrapped in cloth, his body marked by a combat that the seneschal's soft hands made impossible to credit. They brought him back. They healed him for the second time. The same woman applying the same knowledge to the same man, neither of them yet understanding the full geometry of what was accumulating between them. Then Isolde found the sword. This is the moment the tradition treats with particular care, and it deserves the same care here. While Tristan lay recovering in the Irish court under the name Tantris, Isolde went into his quarters to tend to him. She was examining his equipment, as healers do, checking a patient, taking inventory of his state and his possessions. The sword was there. She looked at it, because swords in this world were particular objects identified by their maker's work and their owner's history. She looked at the blade, and she saw a notch in it. The notch was small. A piece of the blade was missing, broken off at some point in a fight, the metal shearing and leaving an absence where it had been. Notches in swords were not unusual. What made this one remarkable was the next thing she did, which was to go to her own chamber and retrieve a small casket she had been keeping. In the casket was a fragment of metal. It was not large, no bigger than a finger, the tradition says in some versions. It had been kept because of what it was and what it had been part of. When the Irish champion Morholt had died in single combat on an island in the sea, his body had been brought back to Ireland. In his skull there had been a fragment from the sword that killed him, and the fragment had been preserved. Grief holds things. The fragment had been kept. Isolde took the fragment from the casket and brought it to the sword. She fitted it to the notch. It entered the notch exactly. The fit was complete. A key, the tradition says in some tellings, returning to the lock it had been made from. The shape of the absence in the blade corresponded perfectly to the shape of what had been removed from a dead man's skull, and the correspondence could mean only one thing about the man who carried the sword. She stood over him. The sword was in her hands. Tristan lay still, whether because he was too weak to move or because he understood that moving was not the right response to what was happening. The tradition does not say with certainty, but the image it preserves is of a man who did not resist. His hands were open at his sides. The sword was above him. The room was entirely still. What was happening in that room was not simple. Morholt had been her kinsman. His death had been his own doing. In one accounting, he had arrived in Cornwall, armed and armored, to enforce a humiliating tribute, and the combat had been a legitimate one, a knight of the aggrieved court meeting the champion of the demand. In another accounting, he was her family, and the man lying before her with his hands open had killed him and then come into her court under a name that was not his, accepted her hospitality, accepted her healing, accepted everything she had given him under the fiction of a false identity. Both accountings were true at the same time. This is the room they were in together, a room in which Isolde had every legitimate reason to do what the sword allowed her to do, and also a room in which she had healed this man twice, and knew him, under whatever name he was using, better than anyone else in the court did. The tradition does not present her choice as simple. It presents it as a real choice, made by a woman who could see both sides of what was before her clearly and had to decide which side was going to determine what she did next. She lowered the sword. This is how the tradition describes it. Not that she forgave him, not that she suddenly understood everything and was reconciled to it, but that she lowered the sword. The blade came down from the raised position, came slowly back to her side, came to rest. The room remained still. Tristan continued to kneel on the stone floor, or to lie in his bed. The versions differ on the exact staging of the confrontation, but the physical core of it is consistent across the manuscripts. The sword raised, the sword lowered, the silence that follows. What she felt in that moment, the tradition does not directly state. What it records is the action, the decision expressed not in words, but in the movement of her hands, the weapon returning to the angle of rest. Some versions of the legend note that she later explained her reasoning to her mother, or to Brangaine, the handmaid who appears at the edges of these scenes, that she had understood Tristan's false name for what it was, that she had recognized his identity from the harp playing and the sword together, that she had made the calculation that his value living was greater than his value dead, that he was a knight of King Mark's court, and killing him would bring consequences. These explanations feel like rationalizations of something that happened faster and more simply than any of them describes. She lowered the sword. That is what she did. The negotiations that followed the discovery were conducted with a particular kind of medieval practicality that the tradition renders carefully. Tristan's real name was acknowledged. His mission was acknowledged, that he had come to Ireland not as a harpist, but as an envoy of King Mark of Cornwall, seeking a bride for his king. The irony of this acknowledgement is significant. The man Isolde had just decided not to kill was asking her to accompany him to Cornwall as the future wife of the man he served, and the question of whether she would do this was now laid openly on the table between them. She agreed. The Irish king agreed. The arrangements were made. Isolde would sail to Cornwall with Tristan as her escort, arriving as the bride of Mark. The episode of the sword and the notch and the casket absorbed into the larger political outcome as one of those complications that the living tend to absorb and move past when the alternative is to let it destroy everything. Brangaine went with Isolde. The handmaid had been present through much of what had happened in Ireland, and she would remain present for what came next. Her role in the story is not yet its largest. That comes later, when the ship is crossing the water between Ireland and Cornwall, and a sealed vessel changes hands in a moment of confusion that changes everything. But that is the water still ahead of the ship, and the ship has not yet departed. For now, the image the tradition leaves is this: the sword in Isolde's hands, the sword coming down, Tristan still kneeling on the stone floor with his hands at his sides, the room holding the silence of a decision that has just been made. Neither of them could have named what was in that room with them beyond the obvious. A sword, a man, a woman, a truth that had just been brought into the open. Whatever else was in the room was not yet named and was not yet acknowledged, and the particular quality of that not yet naming is something the tradition understands with great precision, even if it never quite says so directly. The wound in Tristan's side had been closed. He had been healed twice by the same hands. He had killed the dragon and proven the kill. He had been discovered under his false name and had survived the discovery. He was alive in Ireland under his real name now, and the woman who had held the sword above him had put it down, and whatever that meant was still working itself out in the room between them while the Irish coast waited outside the window and the ship in the harbor waited with it. There is a particular quality to the moments in a story just before everything becomes irrevocable. The tradition understands this quality. It is not dramatic in itself. It does not announce itself with changed light or altered sound. It looks exactly like any other moment in the sequence of moments that make up a life. Two people in a room, a sword put down, the future entirely closed off from their sight, as the future always is, the next chapter of what was going to happen to both of them already written in the shape of things without either of them being able to read it yet. The harp was still in the court somewhere. Tantris had played it for courtiers who had sat in the candlelight and listened without knowing who he was. The name Tantris was done now. The disguise had served its purpose and outlived it. The syllables returned to the silence they came from. What remained was Tristan, his real name, his real identity, his real wound, healed for the second time by the woman who was now going to board a ship with him and sail toward Cornwall. The room returned to quiet after the sword came down. Outside, the Irish weather was doing whatever it does. Gray sky, perhaps. The sound of the harbor carried inland on the wind, the sea neither rough nor entirely calm. Inside, Tristan was still on the floor with his hands open. Isolde was standing with the sword at her side, and the fragment in the casket fitted exactly to the notch in the blade, and the matching fit of those two pieces of metal was a fact that would not go away, that could not be unfitted or unknown, that sat in the room with them as something permanently established. Neither of them spoke yet. The tradition doesn't record what the first words were after the sword came down, and perhaps that silence is the more honest record, the pause in which both of them understood that something had just shifted in the structure of what they knew about each other, and that neither the old relationship nor anything like it was available to them now. They were something new in that room, without a name for it yet, the name still forming in the space between the sword at rest and the kneeling man and the Irish coast outside the window. This is where the legend leaves them for a moment. Not yet on the ship, not yet on the sea between two countries, not yet anywhere but this room in Ireland, where a woman has just made a choice that the tradition does not simplify, and a man is still kneeling with his hands open, and the harp is somewhere in the building where it was always kept, and the only sound is whatever the Irish wind was doing that afternoon against the stones of the walls. The wound had been opened on an island in the sea, and it had healed here, in this country, at these hands twice. The sword that made the wound was the same sword that carried the evidence in its notch, and the evidence had been recognized, and the sword had been raised and then lowered. The chain of cause and consequence connecting all these things was precise and clean, the kind of clean that only becomes visible looking backward from a later point, when everything has already resolved into the shape it was always taking. Looking forward from that room, nothing was visible yet. There was a ship in the harbor, There was a sea crossing ahead. There was Cornwall at the other end of the crossing, and King Mark waiting in Cornwall, and a future that both of them were about to enter together. The two fragments of metal, the notch and the shard, still fitted perfectly to one another, still constituted their quiet and unanswerable proof. The sword was down, the room was still, the room was still. Tristan remained kneeling on the stone floor, the space between them holding everything that had just been decided, and everything that neither of them yet understood about what comes next. In a stone room somewhere on the Irish coast, a woman worked in the particular quiet of early morning, while the harbor below was still dark, and the sound of the ship's rigging carried up through the narrow window with every shift of the offshore wind. The room smelled of dried herbs and seawater and something else, something that had no name, a visitor would easily reach for, the accumulated presence of knowledge practiced over many years in a small space. The Queen of Ireland's hands moved with the steady, unhurried precision of someone doing work they have done many times before, measuring what needed to be measured, reducing what needed to be reduced, combining things that most people would not have thought to combine. Outside, the tide was pulling, the harbor was waiting, what she was making was a gift. That is the first thing the tradition holds about the love potion, not that it was an instrument of fate, not that it was a working of dark or dangerous craft, but that a mother made it as a practical expression of love for a daughter who was going far away and would need, in the new country, whatever help could be carried there for her. The Queen had been watching the match with the particular attention of a woman who understood political arrangements and also understood what they often cost the people required to fulfill them. Her daughter Isolde was going to Cornwall. She was going to become the wife of a king she had never met, in a court whose language was not her first language, in a country whose landscape was nothing like the one she had grown up in. A mother could pack cloth and jewelry. She could send servants. She could send, tucked among the ordinary provisions, a small sealed vessel of something she had made with her own hands that would ensure the king and his new queen found their way toward one another and did not have to find it alone. The vessel itself was not large. The tradition does not spend much time describing what it looked like, which is its own kind of detail. It was not a thing of obvious spectacle, not a glowing bottle from a story told to children, but something more domestic than that, sealed carefully, the kind of object that could sit among the other provisions of a sea voyage without drawing any attention to itself. The Queen brought Brangane to her in that early morning hour and placed the vessel into both of her hands. Brangane was Isolde's closest attendant, her companion from childhood, the person who would travel with her to Cornwall and remain there in service to her. The Queen spoke quietly. She said what the vessel contained, and she said what it was for, and she said when it must be used, and when it must not. The instruction was specific. The potion was for Isolde and King Mark. It was to be given to them on their wedding night, and on that night only, when two people who did not yet know one another would be required to become husband and wife in every sense the word required. That was the occasion the Queen had brewed it for. That was the container in which the gift was meant to be held. Brangane listened. She held the vessel with both hands, feeling its weight, and she understood what she was carrying and what it was for. Then the ship was ready, and the morning was moving, and there was no more time for the quiet of the stone room. The Irish coast would have been visible for a while as the ship moved out, the familiar headlands growing smaller at the same rate that the open water grew larger. And then at some point between departure and arrival, the land simply stops being a reference, and the sea becomes the whole world available. A crossing from Ireland to Cornwall is not a long voyage by the measure of ocean travel. It is a matter of days rather than weeks, the kind of passage that a capable ship in reasonable weather can accomplish before either shore becomes entirely abstract. The tradition does not specify what the weather was. What the oldest versions give instead is an account of the particular emotional atmosphere aboard the ship, which was not easy. Isolde was not going willingly, in the way that willingness is usually meant. She understood the political logic of the match. Her kingdom needed peace with Cornwall, and the tribute system that Tristan had ended when he killed Morholt could only be formally resolved by this alliance, this marriage, this transfer of an Irish princess to the Cornish court. She understood all of this because she was not a figure who failed to understand things. Her understanding was precisely the difficulty. She knew why she was on this ship. She knew who had arranged the circumstances that required her to be on it, and among the people aboard, moving about the deck with the ease of a man entirely at home on a sea voyage, was Tristan, the knight of King Mark's court, who had come to Ireland as an envoy to negotiate the match, the man whose sword had a notch that fit a blade fragment she had once kept in a casket, the man she had stood over with a sword in her hand, and then, for reasons she had not fully finished examining, chosen not to kill. Between these two people, then, on this ship, in these first days of the crossing, there was the kind of silence that is not absence of sound, but a very full and particular presence, everything that had happened between them in Ireland, occupying the space around every conversation they did not have, the weight of it making ordinary speech seem both necessary and impossible. Tristan was bringing her to marry his uncle. He had been sent to Ireland for exactly this purpose. The match he had negotiated was the successful completion of his mission, the thing that would prove his loyalty and his usefulness to the king who had raised him. There was nothing in the arrangement that invited any other kind of consideration, and so the two of them moved through the early days of the crossing at a careful, maintained distance, the ship proceeding, the sea doing what the sea does, regardless of what is happening on the surface that moves across it. It was in this atmosphere, this careful, effortful, slightly exhausted separateness, that the accident occurred. The tradition tells it simply. A servant, one of the attendants traveling with Isolde's party, came to offer wine to the two passengers who sat together in the quiet of the ship's interior as the crossing continued. The vessel of wine that was brought was not wine. In the close quarters of the ship's provisions, in the ordinary confusion of a sea voyage, with its particular demands on attention and organization, the sealed vessel the Queen had prepared had found its way among the ordinary drink. The servant poured it without knowing what it was. Tristan and Isolde drank. The tradition does not linger on the drinking itself. There is no description of the taste that might distinguish it, no moment of hesitation or awareness before the cup is emptied. The detail the oldest accounts preserve is not the act of drinking, but what came after it, the pause that fell between the two of them in the moment when something had changed, and neither of them had yet found words for the change. The ship was still on the same sea. The horizon was still the same horizon. The wind was still moving, the rigging in exactly the way it had been moving it all morning, and Tristan and Isolde looked at one another. That pause, the space between the drinking and the first word spoken after it, is where the tradition places its weight, not on the mechanics of what the potion did to the blood or the heart or the will, but on the quality of attention that suddenly moved between two people who had been carefully maintaining distance for days, the way a room changes when a fire is finally lit in it, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the slow expansion of warmth into air that had been holding itself carefully at a lower temperature. Something changed. They looked at one another, and something had already changed before either of them moved or spoke. Brangan understood immediately what had happened. The vessel had been her charge and her responsibility, and the recognition of what she had failed to prevent came to her with the specific quality of a mistake that cannot be corrected. Not a mistake that harms only the person who made it, but one whose consequences will extend outward into other lives and other years in ways she could already begin to estimate. She said nothing. There was nothing useful she could say. The ship continued its crossing. The horizon did not change. The question of what the love potion means within the legend, what it was understood to mean by the people who first told these stories, and the people who first wrote them down, is one that the different manuscript versions answer differently, and the difference is not a small one. In Beru's account, the one that survives as that single incomplete fragment, held in Paris, the potion's power lasts for exactly 3 years. This is a specific duration. It is the detail of a tradition that wanted to think carefully about the question of culpability, about whether two people who have drunk a love potion are responsible for what they feel and do under its influence, and what their responsibility becomes when the influence ends. If the potion lasts 3 years, then there is a before and an after. There is a period during which the lovers act under a compulsion they did not choose and could not have predicted, and there is a period after which they might have acted differently and chose not to. The moral architecture the story builds is complex precisely because of that boundary. Thomas of Britain, composing his version in Anglo-Norman French for a courtly English audience, made a different choice. In Thomas's telling, the potion's effect never wanes. It is not a condition with a duration, but a permanent alteration, something that happened to two people and remained what it was for the rest of their lives, without softening or qualifying, or offering them the space of a sober after. This is a darker architecture, or perhaps simply a different one in which the question of culpability cannot be answered by pointing to a moment when the compulsion lifted and the choice became genuinely free. Both of these versions existed, both were read, both were circulated through courts and scriptoria and the listening halls where stories traveled by ear rather than page. The medieval audience that received the Tristan legend did not receive a single settled text, but a tradition in conversation with itself, the same story told from different angles, with different implications about what love is, and whether it can be willed, and what a person owes to a king and a marriage and a faith, when the thing they feel most intensely is none of those things. The world in which these versions circulated had its own settled views about love potions, or rather its own complicated and somewhat contradictory relationship to the question of whether they worked. The church authorities of the 12th and 13th centuries were explicit in their condemnation. Penitential literature, the texts that guided confessors in assigning penance to those who came to them with admissions of wrongdoing, listed love potions and magical filters among the prohibited practices that a Christian soul was required to avoid and to repent if they had sought them out. The condemnations were specific and regular, which tells its own story. Things do not appear in lists of prohibited practices unless enough people are engaging in those practices to make the prohibition necessary. The church condemned love potions because people used them, or believed they could use them, or paid practitioners to make them. The condemnation acknowledged what it condemned as a real feature of the world its congregations lived in. A scribe working carefully through a penitential text in a scriptorium somewhere in France or England in the late 12th century, adding the prohibition against love potions to the list in the same careful ink used for everything else on the page, was recording the presence of a belief that was widely held and widely acted on. The ink dried, the document was copied. The prohibition traveled from one monastery to another, from one confessor's shelf to the next, carrying inside it the acknowledgement that the people sitting in confession across from a priest in this century believed, with some regularity, that a properly prepared substance could alter another person's feelings, could move a heart that was indifferent or hostile toward love, or could bind a love already present into something more permanent and reliable. The belief was common enough to need prohibiting. The prohibition acknowledged it as a practical and pressing matter. Within this world, then, the love potion in the Tristan legend was not a piece of fantasy that medieval audiences received with the distance of something obviously impossible. It was a recognizable element of the world they actually lived in, a thing that some people made and others sought out, and the church worked consistently to suppress. The story was not asking its audience to suspend disbelief about whether such a thing could exist. It was asking them instead to think about what it meant when one did, what it meant for the two people who drank it, what it meant for the vows they were now in the process of not keeping, what it meant for a king who did not know, and would not know for some time, what had happened on the ship, bringing his bride to him. The legal and moral frameworks of the 12th and 13th centuries were genuinely engaged with these questions. Medieval juridical thought, the tradition of canon law and scholastic theology that was developing rapidly through exactly the period when the Tristan manuscripts were being composed and circulated, held that intent was the central measure of moral responsibility for an act. A person who committed an act of adultery in full knowledge of what they were doing, choosing it freely, bore the full weight of that choice. A person acting under compulsion, under deception, under a force they had not consented to and could not have anticipated, bore a different and more complicated weight. The love potion gave the Tristan legend a specific theological and juridical problem to sit with, and the story's audiences were not naive about that problem. The question of whether Tristan and Isolde were truly guilty of what they had done, truly culpable in the way that adultery was morally culpable in a Christian culture with a feudal hierarchy built partly on the reliability of oaths and marriages, did not have a clean answer. The legend offered the problem without the resolution. The poets and their audiences sat with the problem together. What the potion also gave the legend was something harder to describe in the categories of law and theology, a way of holding together two things that the culture required to be separate. On one side was the feudal arrangement, Isolde married to Mark, Tristan in service to Mark, both of them bound by the systems of obligation and loyalty that held the political world in its shape. On the other side was the feeling itself, not the courtly abstraction of desire, but something the legend characterizes as total and unasked for, a reorientation of the entire person toward another person that arrived without warning in the middle of a sea voyage and did not ask permission. The potion made it possible to hold both of these things without requiring the story to say one of them was false. The obligation was real. The feeling was real. The collision between them was the thing the legend was actually exploring, and the potion made it possible to explore that collision, honestly, without requiring the lovers to be either fully guilty or entirely innocent. On the ship, none of this was yet the shape of things. The potion had been drunk, and something had happened, and the crossing was continuing, and Brangaine sat somewhere else on the ship, with the knowledge of what she had failed to prevent, and the Irish coast was now entirely behind them, and the Cornish coast not yet visible ahead. The sea in between was the sea in between. It was neither the world they had come from, nor the world they were going to. It was the interval, the space the tradition needed for the change to occur, for the thing that happened in the stone room in Ireland to become the thing that would be carried into Cornwall and into everything that followed. Tristan and Isolde, sitting in the quiet of the ship's interior with the changed air between them, would not yet have had words for what was happening. The tradition does not give them a long conversation at this moment, does not record speeches or confessions. What it holds instead is the quality of the change, the way two people can find themselves in a state that neither of them chose and neither of them understands, looking at one another while the ordinary world continues around them without any apparent awareness that something has happened. The sea goes on, the rigging moves, the servant who brought the wrong vessel has gone back to wherever servants go on ships. The horizon does not change. What the tradition gives to this moment, in the versions that dwell on it, is a quality of stillness, not the stillness of shock or alarm, but the particular stillness of recognition, of something being acknowledged that was already in some form present before the potion was drunk. Some scholars of the legend have argued that the potion does not create the love, but rather names what was already there, that the weeks Tristan and Isolde had spent in one another's company in Ireland, the specific texture of their encounters, the sword held and then lowered, the harp played under a false name, the healing administered twice, had already laid a foundation that the potion simply brought into full visibility. In this reading, the magic is not an external imposition on two people who would otherwise have felt nothing but a catalyst that did what the situation had already prepared the ground for. Thomas of Britain, whose version presents the effect as permanent, seems to incline toward this reading, toward the idea that what the potion did was not an aberration of nature, but an acceleration of it, a bringing forward of something that had its own reasons for existing. But Bethul's version, with its 3-year limit, inclines differently. In Bethul, the potion's duration is a measure of its externality. The compulsion lasts a specific time, and then it lifts, and when it lifts, both Tristan and Isolde experience the lifting as a kind of return to clarity, to a less clouded vision of what they have and have not done, and what it has cost. The love that remains after the potion wanes in Bethul is not the same as the love that existed during it. It is quieter, sadder, more aware of its own weight. It is the love of people who have been through something together and come out the other side knowing they cannot go back, even though the force that drove them into it has finished doing what it was doing. These two versions of the same legend are not in conflict with one another in any way that requires one to be wrong. They are explorations of the same question from two different angles. What does it mean to be bound to another person by something you did not choose? And what does the bond become when the binding force is no longer what holds it? The poets who composed these versions were not disagreeing about history. They were thinking aloud about love in the same way their audiences were thinking aloud about love, in the space between the stories they told one another and the lives they were actually living, in the complicated overlapping territory of obligation and feeling that the Tristan legend was built to inhabit. The ship moved on its course while all of this was and was not yet the case. The distance between the ship and Cornwall was reducing in the ordinary way that distances reduce. Steadily, incrementally, the horizon holding its shape, while the world on the other side of it came slowly closer. The crossing was the crossing. It had its own duration and its own requirements, and the people aboard it were subject to both in the same way. Everyone is subject to the duration of a passage and the requirements of being at sea. You eat what is available. You sleep when the motion of the water allows it. You occupy the limited space of the deck or the ship's interior, and you wait for the crossing to be complete. And yet the ship, as it moved, was carrying something that had not been aboard when it left Ireland, not the vessel, which was still somewhere among the provisions, but the thing that had come out of it, and could not be put back. Two people moving toward Cornwall in the same ship that had brought them to this point were now moving toward it differently than they would have moved 2 days earlier. The difference was not visible to anyone watching the ship from the outside, not legible in the set of the sails or the behavior of the hull on the water. It was entirely interior, a change in the quality of attention, a change in the register of everything, the way a landscape looks different when the light changes, even though the landscape itself is identical. The Cornish coast, when it began to appear, appeared the way distant coasts always appear to those watching for them. First as a suggestion, a slight thickening of the line between sea and sky that might be cloud or might be land, and then as something more definite, a shape that has specificity and permanence, the gray-green of cliff faces, and the darker interruption of headlands running out into the water. Cornwall has a particular quality of light along its coast, especially in the earlier months of the year, a luminous gray that makes the sea look like hammered metal, and the cliffs look like something drawn rather than grown, their edges clean and deliberate against the water below them. This is the light that the ship would have moved through as the crossing ended, and the destination began to be the thing ahead, rather than the thing toward which they were traveling. The harbor would have taken shape gradually, first the outer cliffs, then the narrowing of the approach, then the particular enclosures of a harbor, breakwaters or natural rock formations, shaping the water into something calmer and more manageable, the signs of a human settlement arranged along the shore in the practical way of places built around the working of the sea. Other ships, figures on the quayside, the sounds that arrive before a harbor does, voices, the cry of birds, the different quality of the water's noise as it moves between fixed structures rather than across open space. Isolde of Ireland stood and watched it arrive. This is what the tradition gives us of her in this moment, not speech, not explanation, not the inner account of what she was feeling as the country she was going to took its final shape in front of her. She stood and she watched. The cliffs were there, the harbor was there. Cornwall was arriving in the way it had always been arriving since the ship left the Irish coast, steadily, at the pace the wind allowed, with no interest in what anyone aboard was ready for. The destination does not wait, it simply becomes the present. Tristan was somewhere on the ship as this happened. The tradition does not always specify where he stood during that final approach, which is a kind of detail that contains its own meaning. The two of them witnessing the arrival from positions the narration leaves slightly uncertain, the ship carrying both of them toward the same shore at the same moment, while each of them held, separately and together, the weight of what the crossing had become. Cornwall was ahead. The voyage was ending. They had come from Ireland as two people maintaining a careful, exhausted distance, and they were arriving in Cornwall as something the legend would spend the rest of its length trying to name. Between them, unnamed, and not yet the problem it was about to become, was the thing that the sealed vessel had brought into the world by being opened at the wrong time, in the wrong hands, by someone who had not known what they were carrying. The Queen of Ireland had made it in a stone room for a specific purpose, and with specific instructions. The instructions had been given and kept, and then, in the ordinary confusion of a sea voyage, failed. The purpose had not been served. Something else had happened instead, something that the Queen had not brewed the vessel to accomplish, and something that nobody aboard the ship had asked for or anticipated, and something that by the time the Cornish cliffs were close enough to read their shadows on the water, had already fully and irreversibly become itself. The harbor came closer. The light moved on the water in the way light moves on water continuously, without pause, each reflection distinct and gone before it can be named. The sound of the rigging changed as the sails were adjusted for the approach. The ship moved between the outer formations of the harbor entrance and into the calmer water inside them. Cornwall was no longer the place the ship was going, it was the place the ship had arrived. Two people stood in the space of that arrival, carrying between them something the language of the courts and the churches and the king's hall. They were moving toward, did not yet have a word for, something that had come into being over open water between two countries, was in the interval between departure and arrival, in the space where the sea had been the only world available. The cliffs were solid behind them now. The harbor was solid around them. The known world was reassembling itself on every side. And the two people who had boarded a ship in Ireland and were now standing in a Cornish harbor had become in the span of a single crossing entirely different from who they had been when they boarded it, carrying together and separately something enormous and still unnamed, watching the shore take shape around them while the water between the ship's hull and the quayside narrowed inch by inch to nothing. In the parish of Fowey, in the county of Cornwall, beside a road that was already old when the Normans arrived, there stands a stone. It is roughly rectangular, approximately 2 meters in height, leaning at a slight angle from the vertical, as though the ground beneath it has been slowly making up its mind about something for the past 15 centuries. The surface of the stone is worn. Wind and rain have softened its edges and smoothed the harder planes of the granite until the whole object has acquired the particular texture of something that has been outside for a very long time and has grown accustomed to it. Carved into that surface, still legible despite everything the weather has done, are the words Tristanus hic iacit Cunomori filius. Here lies Tristanus, son of Cunomoris. The letters are Roman in their form, cut by someone who knew the alphabet of the empire that had recently left Britain and left behind it stones and roads, and the habit of marking the dead with carved names. Whoever carved those letters had a name in mind, and the name was Tristanus, and the name has been there in the granite ever since. The stone was moved at some point in the centuries after its carving, from wherever it originally stood above a grave, to a roadside location near Castle Door, which lies a few miles north of Fowey, its Iron Age earthworks still visible in the landscape as a series of low grass-covered ramparts enclosing the ghost of a space that was once, by all available measures, significant. Scholars have argued about the stone's precise relationship to the site. The movement itself is not unusual. Memorial stones across Britain and Ireland were frequently relocated, repurposed, reset into later walls, used as gatepost foundations, laid flat in churchyards, or simply lost. That this one remained above ground and legible is in the particular arithmetic of survival that governs these things, a kind of fortune. What the stone does not do is prove anything. The name Tristanus is closely related to the name Tristan. The name Cunomoris, which in its Brythonic form means something like great hound or sea hound, appears in a Latin hagiography from the 9th century as the name of a powerful ruler of Cornwall or Brittany who was feared by those around him. Whether the Tristanus of the stone was a real man whose life contained even the faintest outline of what the legend describes, whether the stone marks a grave or a commemorative site, whether the connection to the stories is direct or coincidental, none of this has been settled, and there is no reason to think it will be. The stone stands in its field. The letters hold their shape in the granite. The rest is what the imagination does with a name and the landscape around it. The hagiography that preserves the name Cunomoris is the life of St. Paul Aurelian, composed in 884 by a monk named Remenach at a monastery in Brittany, It is a saint's life in the conventional form of such documents, a narrative of virtues, miracles, foundations, and the particular geography of a holy man's travels, and Cunamoris appears in it as a regional ruler whose power was real enough to require careful handling by the saint. The text calls him by the Brythonic name, and the Brythonic name has been there in the manuscript ever since Remenuk's quill deposited it. What Roman Oak knew about Cunamoris, whether the man was alive within living memory of the text, or already a generation or two removed, whether the stories about him were already becoming something other than straightforward history, the hagiography does not say. A monk writes what he needs to write. The margin receives what the main text cannot accommodate. The name passes from whatever Cunamoris actually was into the record that will carry it forward, which is a different kind of existence than the one he had when he was breathing. Castle Dor itself, the site most often associated with the historical mark of the legend, is not a castle in any medieval sense. It is an Iron Age hill fort, a roughly oval enclosure defined by two concentric banks and ditches, the outer bank approximately 6 meters high when measured from the bottom of its ditch, the whole structure commanding a position on a slight rise above what was once, and in some weathers still is, genuinely impressive Cornish landscape. Excavations conducted in the 1930s found evidence of substantial timber buildings within the enclosure, including what appeared to be a large feasting hall and a smaller structure that may have served a ceremonial or residential function, dated to somewhere in the 5th or 6th century. This is the period the legend places mark in. The ground at Castle Dor still holds the faint undulations of those vanished structures, shallow depressions and gentle rises, where the timber posts rotted and the floors settled over the centuries, the place preserving the outline of what stood there without preserving anything of what went on inside it. The Cornwall of the legend is a small kingdom with a specific political problem. Since before the story's beginning, the kingdom has been bound by a tribute arrangement with Ireland, an arrangement enforced by an Irish champion whose annual or periodic arrival marks the terms of the relationship between the two kingdoms in unmistakable physical form. Young men and women of Cornwall are the tribute, and the champion who comes to collect them is a warrior named Morholt, the Queen of Ireland's brother, whose presence in Cornish waters is both an assertion of Irish power and a reminder of what Cornwall has been unable to do about it. The barons of Mark's court, the men who sit along the walls of the Great Hall and conduct the ordinary business of a small kingdom's governance, disputes over land, the administration of tribute, the management of borders, the entertainment of the king, understand this arrangement as a fact of their world, the way that men in any period understand arrangements that have always existed and that no one currently living has the power to change. The political texture of the legend's Cornwall is carried largely through four figures who appear as Tristan's antagonists within the court. The manuscript traditions give their names variously as Andret, Goanon, Gondoin, and Denoaun, though the spelling shifts across different versions with the easy fluidity of names that were moving through oral tradition before they settled into writing. They are not simple villains. The story is careful about this in the way that good stories about political worlds are careful. The barons believe themselves to be acting in good conscience, and the version of events they are operating from has a reasonable claim to being correct. They are men who have sworn loyalty to Mark and who can see, plainly and without distortion, what is happening between his wife and his nephew. Their concern is not invented. Their reading of the situation is not wrong. That they are the legend's antagonists has more to do with where the legend's sympathies lie than with any failure of their judgment. Andret, in particular, is in several manuscript versions a kinsman of Tristan, a cousin, or a figure with a complicated blood connection to both Mark and to the hero, and his opposition to Tristan therefore carries the particular weight of family divided against itself. He watches, he reports, he arranges the circumstances that reveal what needs to be revealed to the king. He does what a loyal counselor of a betrayed king would be expected to do, and he does it with the methodical patience of someone who believes the situation demands it. The legend does not ask the reader to approve of him. It does not need to ask the reader to understand him. What the barons want, across the various scenes of court surveillance and arranged revelation that structure this portion of the narrative, is for the king to act on what the evidence shows him. They want the clarity that formal condemnation would bring, the acknowledgement that what has been done to Mark's honor cannot be overlooked, that the king is not required to continue bearing the particular weight of this particular knowledge without relief. They arrange encounters. They set watches. They present evidence at the moments when it cannot be denied. They are doing, in the specific vocabulary of feudal loyalty, exactly what their position requires of them. The trouble is that Mark keeps declining to receive their gift. Mark himself is the figure in the legend who resists the categories the story seems to be offering him. He is the wronged husband. He is the betrayed king. He is the man with the clearest claim to anger in the entire narrative, and the figure toward whom no one, including the text, is entirely sure what feeling is appropriate. The manuscript versions are not consistent about him, and their inconsistency is interesting. In some, he is a figure of genuine nobility, a man whose love for both Tristan and Isolde is specific and unconditional enough to survive the thing being done to it. In others, he is weaker, more susceptible to the baron's arguments, a man carried between mercy and condemnation by whichever current reaches him last. In all versions, he returns repeatedly and against the evidence to something that functions like trust, or at minimum to a sustained and deliberate refusal to allow the evidence to carry the full weight it is asking to carry. There is a scene preserved in Beyrul's version, the longest surviving account of the court intrigue period, in which Mark approaches the forest shelter where Tristan and Isolde are sleeping. He finds them lying apart, a sword placed between them, and takes this as evidence that the innocence he wants to believe in is the innocence that exists. He draws his own gloves from his belt and lays them beside Isolde's hand while she sleeps. He exchanges his ring for Tristan's on her finger, quietly, without waking either of them. He adjusts the lean of a branch to shade her face from the sun, and then he walks back into the forest and returns to court, carrying what he has decided to decide. The sword between them is Tristan's, placed there, the story suggests, as a sign of restraint, a physical marker of a boundary the two lovers have placed between themselves. Mark reads it as proof of innocence, or chooses to read it so, or performs the reading of it while knowing perfectly well what performance he is engaged in. The text does not entirely clarify which of these is happening. What is clear is that the king who placed his gloves beside a sleeping woman's hand and walked quietly back through the trees is not a man who has been fooled. He is a man who has decided, for reasons the legend leaves partly in shadow, that this is what his love will look like. The tribunal scenes earlier in the narrative, in which the barons bring their evidence before the court and demand formal action, show Mark in a different posture, harried, conflicted, unable to arrive at a position that satisfies the competing claims of justice and affection. Beyrul's Mark condemns the lovers more than once, and more than once changes course. He sets aside punishments he has ordered. He accepts explanations that would not survive examination. He grants reprieves that no baron of his court would grant if the decision were theirs to make. The barons watch all of this with the frustrated patience of men who understand that their king is not going to do what they have calculated the situation requires, and that they cannot force him to it without becoming something they are not yet willing to become. There is a strand of the narrative in which the barons arrange for a spy to conceal himself in a tree above a garden meeting point, and the reflected image of this spy, or the shadow of the king himself in another version, falls on the ground where Tristan and Isolde are standing, alerting them before anything can be said that would prove beyond question what has been merely suspected. The scene has the texture of a trap, narrowly avoided, but it is not framed as such. It is framed as what it is, which is two people who are accustomed to being watched, moving through a world in which watchfulness is simply the condition they inhabit. They have been in this world long enough to have learned its patterns. They can read a shadow on the ground the way a sailor reads water. The political stakes of the legend's court sequences are specific and worth dwelling in. Mark is a king without a direct heir, which in the feudal world of the 12th century imagination is not a personal sorrow, but a structural problem of some urgency. Tristan is his sister's son, which makes him the closest available kinsman, and in the absence of a legitimate son, the most probable successor to whatever Mark has built. The barons who oppose Tristan are not only concerned with the honor of the queen, they are concerned with the question of whose interest is served by the arrangement that currently exists, and whether Tristan's position at court is as straightforwardly that of a loyal nephew as it appears. These concerns are not cynical. They are the concerns of men in a world where succession and legitimacy are the architecture everything else is built on. Into this world, Isolde arrives as a queen, already partially known to the court, a woman of Irish royal blood, brought across the sea as a carefully negotiated political match, whose status as queen is formally unassailable, and whose position as a stranger in Cornwall is equally certain. She comes with her handmaid Brangane, who is one of the more quietly remarkable figures in the legend, a woman who knows the entire history of the situation, who carries a particular burden of guilt for her own role in events, and who protects both the queen and the secret with a loyalty that does not waver despite the cost. Brangane substitutes for the queen on the wedding night, concealing what must be concealed, and carries this knowledge forward through every subsequent scene of the court narrative. Her position in the legend is a study in what loyalty looks like when it has been made impossibly complex by the circumstances that required it. The two traditions that lie behind the legend's political world are worth holding beside one another for a moment. The first is the old Irish narrative of Torre Hocht Diarmada agus Grina, the pursuit of Diarmid and Grina, in which a king's intended bride falls for a younger warrior at a wedding feast and compels him to flee with her, setting in motion a pursuit through the landscape of Ireland that covers years and enormous distances. The king in that story is Fionn mac Cumhal, the leader of the warrior band called the Fina, and the triangle of obligation and betrayal and reluctant pursuit that structures the Irish narrative maps with striking precision onto the triangle of Mark, Tristan, and Isolde. In both traditions, the king is not monstrous. In both, the warrior is not simply a rebel. In both, the woman is a force that moves the story rather than a passive object passed between men. The second tradition is Cornish or Brittonic or some earlier Celtic substrate that gave both the Irish and the Cornish variants what they share, a root sense of the story as a narrative about what loyalty costs when it is divided against itself, about what a man owes a king and what he owes himself, and whether those two things can simultaneously be honored. The legend grew in the space between those two claims, and it never entirely resolves the tension between them, which is part of why it has been told and retold for as long as it has. Beowulf's account of the court intrigue period preserves several trial scenes and near escapes with considerable narrative specificity. The burning ordeal that never quite takes place, the formal accusations and their deflections, and the elaborate oath by which Isolde technically speaks the truth while concealing it inside the truth's own language. These scenes have attracted considerable scholarly attention as evidence of medieval attitudes toward judicial procedure, the role of oath swearing in 12th century law, and the relationship between formal innocence and actual guilt. The equivocal oath, in which Isolde swears that no man save her husband, and a certain poor pilgrim has held her between his thighs, the poor pilgrim being Tristan in disguise, who carried her ashore, is one of the most discussed passages in the entire legend, because it sits at the intersection of several systems of meaning that the 12th century cared about deeply: the binding power of spoken language, the nature of divine witness, the question of whether a technically accurate statement that produces a false impression constitutes a lie, in the sense that matters. The church authorities who wrote about these questions in their penitential literature were not primarily concerned with Tristan and Isolde, but they were concerned with exactly the problems the legend dramatizes. What does intent do to the moral weight of an act? If an oath is sworn in words that are technically true while being designed to deceive, is the oath binding? If a passion was involuntary in its origin, does the sin it leads to carry the same weight as a sin chosen freely? These are not questions the legend was invented to ask, but they are questions the legend keeps returning to, as though the story itself has noticed that it is moving through a moral landscape that has not been mapped yet. King Mark's relationship to this moral complexity is perhaps the most quietly interesting thing about his characterization. He is the person to whom the deception is being done, and he is also, repeatedly and against what his advisors tell him is his own interest, the person who decides not to press the deception to its conclusion. He could condemn. He has enough evidence, more than enough evidence, and the barons are always at hand to assist. He does not. The mercy he keeps returning to is not naivety. Beowulf's Mark is not a foolish man, and it is not political calculation, because his repeated failure to act is politically costly in exactly the ways the barons have identified. It is something else, something the legend does not have a single word for, which is perhaps why it keeps returning to the same scene: the king at the edge of the clearing, the sword between the sleepers, the ring quietly exchanged, the decision made again in the dark. The forest shelter scene is worth dwelling in for a moment longer, because it is the scene in which Mark's character becomes most fully itself. He has been told by the barons where the lovers are sleeping. He has ridden to find them. He arrives at the shelter to discover the two people whose relationship has been the central crisis of his reign lying apart, the sword between them, their faces turned away from one another in sleep. He stands at the edge of the clearing and looks at them for a long time. The text gives him this stillness, this space of looking before acting, and what he does with it is to read the scene in the direction that allows him to keep what he has already decided he wants to keep. He sets his own gloves beside Isolde's hand. He takes the ring from her finger and replaces it with his own, and takes his own ring and sets it where hers was. These are not the actions of a man who has been deceived. They are the actions of a man who is communicating something to people he knows will understand the message when they wake and find it. He is telling them he was there. He is telling them he chose, again, what mercy looks like in his particular case. And then he rides back through the trees toward a court that will ask him questions he is not going to answer in the way they are hoping: the gesture of the gloves, The ring quietly exchanged in the still air of a forest clearing, while two people sleep. This is the image the narrative returns to when it wants to show what Mark actually is. Not a man above grief, not a man indifferent to what has been done to him. A man whose grief has found its form in an action so private and so small that no chronicle would have thought to record it if the story had not needed it to be there. The world of Mark's court extends beyond Cornwall in the legend's geography, into Brittany, into Ireland, into the sea passages that connect them, into the courts of other kings who appear briefly as context and then recede. The legend's sense of scale is genuinely that of the early medieval Atlantic world, a world in which people moved by ship through seas that were dangerous but passable, in which Ireland and Cornwall and Brittany were not exotic destinations, but adjacent territories with established relationships of trade and kinship and political obligation. The Tristan of the legend is plausibly a man of this world, a warrior courier comfortable at sea, at home in multiple languages and multiple courts, the kind of man that a small kingdom like Mark's would value precisely because he could move in the spaces between fixed territories. The Irish dimension of this world is present throughout. Ireland in the legend is not simply the place Isolde came from. It is a kingdom with its own political logic, its own court, its own system of obligations and insults, and the Irish queen who brewed the love potion is a figure with her own kind of authority, a woman whose understanding of what her daughter needed for her marriage was not wrong given what the queen knew and what she was trying to provide. The legend asks the reader to hold this sympathy for the Irish court alongside everything that follows from the potion's misdirection, which is one of the ways it maintains its moral complexity. The tragedy did not come from malice, not even from carelessness in any straightforward sense, but from the gap between what was intended and what happened. And that gap was something no one inside the story had the power to prevent. The barons of Mark's court, returning to them for a moment before the section ends, are worth understanding as a kind of chorus to the main action. Men who speak the values of the world. The lovers are transgressing, who articulate what the transgression costs the king, and therefore costs the court, and therefore costs the whole structure of obligation that makes the court possible. They are not wrong about the facts. They are not wrong about the values. They are simply on the outside of an experience that the legend has placed beyond the reach of their judgment, not because their judgment is faulty, but because the story has decided that what Tristan and Isolde are inside is not a category the Baron's judgment was built to address. This is not a comfortable position for the audience. It was probably not a comfortable position for the 12th century audiences, who first encountered it in the candlelit halls of courts, not entirely unlike Mark's own. The Tristan stone stands in a field near Fowey, and the field is quiet, and the sea is a few miles away in every direction that matters, and the stone has been leaning at its slight angle for as long as anyone currently living can remember, and considerably longer. The Latin letters say what they have always said: here lies Drastanus, son of Cunamoris. Whether Drastanus and Tristan are the same person, whether the stone marks the grave of a man whose life contained even the shadow of what the legend describes, whether Castle Door's grass-covered ramparts are the floor plan of Mark's Hall, or simply the floor plan of a hall that happened to be there in the right century, none of this will be resolved by anything currently available to resolve it. The stone holds its name. The earthworks hold their shape. The legend keeps moving through both of them, carrying whatever it has always carried, which is the particular weight of a story about what loyalty costs and what love does when it exceeds the structures built to contain it. What Castle Door's excavations found was the outline of a space where people ate and argued and made decisions and told stories to one another in the dark. The hall that stood inside those earthworks had a hearth at its center, probably, and the fire would have thrown light against the timber walls in the way that fire always throws light. And someone in that hall, or in a hall like it, would have known a version of this story before it had a name. The story was already old by the time anyone thought to write it down. It was already moving through the courts, and the stone carvings, and the named places on the Atlantic coast, finding the shape it needed, before Beowulf set it on vellum, and before Thomas composed his Anglo-Norman verses for an English court's candlelit audience. It grew into writing from a substrate of spoken things that no manuscript has fully preserved. Mark walked back through the trees. The clearing behind him held the sleepers and the sword, and the ring he had left in exchange for his own, and the gloves beside Isolde's hand, and the light moving slowly through the canopy above them, and everything he had decided not to do. He moved between the trees until the clearing was no longer visible, until the forest closed behind him, and there was only the sound of his horse moving through leaf mulch, and the particular sound of a man carrying a decision that no one in his court was ever going to understand completely. He had been a king when he arrived at the clearing. He was still a king when he left it. What had changed was something the legend does not have a single word for, something it keeps circling in scene after scene without quite landing on, which is perhaps the truest thing it knows about the experience it is describing. The barons were waiting at court when he returned. They were always waiting. They had their questions and their evidence and their genuine, unfeigned loyalty to a man they believed deserved better than what he was being given. Mark rode past them and dismounted and said whatever he said, and the court went about its business. And the trees in the forest went on being the trees they had always been, and somewhere in the direction of the clearing Tristan and Isolde were waking and finding the gloves beside her hand, and the ring on her finger that was not the ring that had been there when they fell asleep. They understood what it meant. They understood what had been decided, and what it had cost the man who decided it, and what the decision required of them now. The legend carries all of this without explaining it. It simply holds the scene in place, the king walking back through the trees, the forest closing behind him, the particular silence of a clearing where no one is left to hear the wind moving through the high branches, and the story continuing in every direction at once. The forest of Moru had no roads running through it. That is how Beowulf describes it. A forest so dense and so wide that the world of courts and castles and obligations simply ceased to apply once a person crossed into its interior. The trees pressed close enough that the canopy above became continuous, a single living ceiling of oak and ash and thorn, through which the light arrived already filtered, already changed, no longer the direct light of open fields, but something broken into pieces and scattered, moving with the wind, shifting slowly across the forest floor while the branches turned above. The smell of it was the smell of damp bark and leaf mulch, and the cold particularity of soil that has been soil for a very long time. Deep inside, at any hour of the day, the sound was the same, wind finding its way through the upper branches, the occasional call of something moving at a distance, and beneath all of it, a quiet that was not really silence, but had the quality of silence, the quality of a place where no human voice had been raised in a very long time. This was the forest into which Tristan and Isolde disappeared. They had been sent from Mark's court, or had fled it, or some combination of the two, that the different manuscript versions weigh slightly differently in their accounts. What all the versions agree on is the forest itself, its vastness, its indifference, the way it received them and closed behind them. Beryl describes them living there for something close to 3 years. 3 years without a hall or a fire laid by servants, without the particular rhythms of court life, without the clothes and the food and the ordered sequence of days that Isolde had known since childhood. They moved constantly inside the forest, making no permanent camp, hunting to eat. Isolde's court clothing, made for the life she had been living, gradually fell into rags against the work of daily survival. What the forest required was not what either of them had been trained for, and they gave it what it required, and the time passed the way time passes inside a dense woodland, not in the ordered units of courts and calendars, but in the longer rhythms of season and weather, and the slow change of light across the year. There is a specific scene in Beryl's account that has stayed in the tradition with particular persistence. King Mark, led to the forest by the 4 barons who have been watching the lovers and collecting evidence of their betrayal, finds at last the place where Tristan and Isolde are sleeping. They are lying in a forest shelter, but between them, placed there in the particular sleep of people who have not yet fully resolved the question of what they are to one another, there is a drawn sword. Mark stands at the edge of the clearing and looks at them for a long time. The drawn sword, in the moral logic of the tradition, means something. It speaks of restraint, of a distance maintained even in the place where no one could observe them. Mark sees this. He sees the sword, and what he does next is not what a king in full confidence of his own justice would do. He does not wake them. He does not draw his own sword. Instead, he removes the glove from Isolde's hand and replaces it with one of his own, a gesture so quiet and so strange that it carries more meaning than any declaration. He exchanges his sword for Tristan's lying beside them, and then he walks back into the trees. The light moved across their sleeping faces after he had gone. The forest made its usual sounds. They did not wake. What that scene holds is something the entire legend is working toward without quite being able to say directly. Mark knows. He has always known, or suspected, or arranged not to know, in the way that people arrange these things when the knowing would require action they cannot bring themselves to take. The sword placed between the sleeping lovers offers him the story he needs, the story that lets him make the choice he has been making over and over since the beginning. He chooses them. He chooses not to destroy what he loves in the name of what he is owed. The glove left in place of his own, the sword exchanged. These are the gestures of a man composing, in the only language available to him, something like forgiveness, or something like the performance of forgiveness that eventually, through repetition, becomes the thing itself. In Beryl's version, the 3 years in the forest end because the love potion's term expires. This is the particular quality of Beryl's telling. The potion has a limit. After 3 years, something shifts in both of them. The passion does not vanish, but it clarifies into something more complicated, something that can now see itself from a slight distance and take account of what it has cost. Isolde speaks aloud what she has not been able to say before. She says that she would not want things to have been otherwise, but she can also see now what queenship meant, what life at Mark's court offered her, what the forest has taken from her and from both of them. The rags she is wearing are a fact she can no longer ignore. The life she left behind is a fact she can no longer fully dismiss. The recognition is not a withdrawal of love, but a widening of the frame around it, the same feeling held in a more honest accounting of the world it exists inside. The hermit Ogren appears in Beryl's account as a figure who sits at the intersection of the forest and everything outside it. He lives at the forest's edge, in a small stone dwelling that is neither the wilderness where the lovers have been surviving, nor the court they came from. He is old enough and settled enough in his particular vocation to be beyond the immediate politics of the situation, and when Tristan and Isolde come to him, he receives them without alarm. His function in the story is part pastoral, part diplomatic, and the combination is oddly touching. Here is a man whose formal role is the care of souls, pressed into service as the author of a letter that will carry the terms of a negotiation between an exiled knight and his king. Aaron sits at his rough wooden table with the lamp burning and the trees pressing close on every side, and he writes. The quill moves carefully. The words he sets down are Tristan's words, but shaped by the hermit's literacy and his practical sense of what a king needs to be offered in order to take the step he is being asked to take. The letter proposes that Isolde be returned to Mark's court. It offers the terms by which this return can be arranged without requiring anyone to publicly name what has happened between them. It is, in its way, a piece of political writing as much as a spiritual one, the hermit understanding, in his long acquaintance with the way human lives actually proceed, that the best outcome available is not the complete one, but the livable one. Tristan carries the letter out of the forest and sends it to court, and the negotiation that follows is conducted at the same level of careful indirection. Mark, who has already shown what kind of man he is by leaving his glove beside a sleeping woman's hand and walking away without waking her, receives the letter and makes his decision in the same spirit. Isolde returns to court. Tristan does not. The forest life ends the way things end when they have run their natural term, not with a catastrophe, but with a quieting, a gradual adjustment of the light. What comes after is a series of returns and departures, accusations and clearings of names, periods of Tristan at court, and periods of Tristan in exile, the whole elaborate and painful management of a feeling that does not resolve into something more convenient, simply because the people carrying it would find resolution convenient. He goes to Brittany. He is wounded again by a poisoned blade whose venom no physician can counter, and the wound does not close. The versions of the legend that survive are not entirely consistent about the circumstances of this final wounding. Some connect it to a battle, others to an ambush, but what all of them hold in common is the wound's particular quality. It will only close if Isolde of Ireland comes to treat it. She is the only person who has healed him before. She is the only person whose knowledge of what afflicts him is sufficient to address it now. In Brittany, Tristan has made a marriage. She is Isolde of the White Hands, a Breton princess whose name echoes the Irish queen's, and the tradition has understood this echo as deliberate, as a sign of the degree to which Tristan has been trying to live the life available to him rather than the life he cannot have. The marriage is described as unconsummated, a detail that different versions handle with different degrees of explicitness, but the sense underlying all of them is the same. Tristan has made the gesture toward an ordinary life, has taken the step that might anchor him in a world where the ordinary choices are still possible, and has found that the gesture cannot be completed. The wound he carries is older than this marriage. It arrives from further back than Brittany. He sends his companion Caradin by ship to Ireland to find Isolde of Ireland and bring her across the sea if she will come. The agreement they make before the ship departs is practical and simple, and contains in its simplicity everything that is about to go wrong. If Isolde of Ireland comes aboard the ship to return with Carherdine, the ship will sail home under white sails. If she does not come, if she cannot be persuaded, or is prevented, or has simply decided against it, the ship will return with black sails, and Tristan will know from his window what the sails mean before anyone has to speak. The ship sails. Tristan waits. The waiting is conducted at the particular temperature of a person who has been ill for a long time and has arrived at the stage of illness where time no longer passes the way it used to, where hours do not mark themselves in the usual way, where the room is both too small and too large, where the mind moves through the same few images repeatedly without arriving anywhere new. He waits at the window when he can. He waits in the bed when he cannot. He had been a warrior who crossed the Irish Sea alone in a boat without oars to find healing. He had been the man who killed a dragon in a field and lay near death in the wet grass with the evidence of the kill wrapped and held against his body. He had been the person who knelt with his hands open at his sides while a sword was raised above him and had waited to learn what the woman holding it would decide. Now he waits again. The window shows the harbor. The harbor shows the sea. Isolde of the white hands was in the room. She had been in the room all along, had heard the arrangement made about the sails, had understood its meaning with the clarity of someone who has understood for a long time the exact dimensions of her husband's heart and how much room she occupies in it. When the ship was sighted entering the harbor, she went to the window. She looked at the sails. The sails were white. She turned from the window to the bed where her husband lay, and she told him the sails were black. The tradition does not enlarge on what she was feeling when she said this. It does not offer her interior reasoning, does not explain whether she was acting from grief or from some sudden compression of all the years of waiting into a single moment where the lie was simply what came out. She said the sails were black, and the saying of it was done. Tristan heard her. The harbor was outside the window, with the white sails in it, and he heard her say black, and the difference between those two words, the difference between white and black, between the sail that would mean coming and the sail that would mean absence, contained everything that remained of the distance between what had actually happened in his life and what might have happened instead. He turned his face toward the wall. He spoke Isolde's name 3 times, the name of the woman whose sails were white in the harbor. The name became smaller with each speaking. The third was barely sound at all. By the time Isolde of Ireland came ashore and made her way to the room where he lay, the room was already holding its particular silence. She was too late by the margin of a name spoken 3 times into a wall. She lay down beside him on the bed, as the versions tell it, not as a dramatic gesture, but as the thing she knew how to do, the only available response to what the room was asking of her. She had healed him before, twice, in Ireland, and this time the wound was one she had not been present to treat. The versions that describe her death report it simply and without ceremony. She died beside him, in the room in Brittany, and the 2 of them were taken back across the sea to Cornwall for burial. This is the part of the story that Barrule's surviving fragment does not reach. The manuscript ends before the deaths, in the middle of the events that precede them, its final lines going to the edge of the damaged vellum and stopping there. What is known of the ending comes from the other versions, from Eilhart and from Thomas, and from the prose traditions that followed them, each one carrying the same ending in its own way. The details shift. The emotional weight of each scene is distributed differently by different hands, but the ending holds across all of them. Tristan calls the name. The room goes quiet, and Isolde arrives in the silence. They were buried in Cornwall, the tradition holds, in graves placed beside one another. The specific location varies across the versions, as so many things in this legend vary across its versions, but the image that follows the burial is remarkably consistent across texts written in different languages over several centuries. From the graves, something grows. In some versions, it is a rose and a vine. In others, it is two hazel trees. The names of the plants change, but the pattern is the same in every case. Two separate things growing from the earth, rooted in adjacent ground, rising separately at first, and then finding one another as they grow. Their stems coming together above the soil, their growth continuing in one twined upward movement that no one has planted or tended or pruned into that shape. It simply grows that way because the roots beneath it are oriented toward the same warmth, the same light, the same opening in the canopy above. King Mark, in some versions of the tradition, orders the plants cut down when he is told of their growth. The plants grow back. The order is given again. The plants grow back again. Eventually, Mark stops giving the order, or the versions stop reporting it, and the plants continue as they have been continuing all along, quietly, without urgency, without awareness of the order that has been issued against them, putting out new growth in every season, because that is the work of living wood. The roots go deeper in the dark, the stems above the soil thicken slightly with each year. The intertwining continues. What the tradition is doing with this image is something it has been working toward since the beginning. The love potion, in the readings that have come down through the centuries, was understood by medieval audiences as a device that partially lifted the lovers out of the full weight of moral responsibility for what happened between them, the involuntary nature of the passion, the fact that neither of them chose it with a clear mind, complicated the straightforward condemnation the story might otherwise have attracted. But the plants growing from the graves are not subject to that logic. No potion made them grow toward one another. The earth made them grow. Whatever the roots are doing in the dark below the soil, they are doing it entirely on their own, in the silence beneath the ground, without any external cause. The tradition needs to account for. The image is very old, older than Beirut, older than Thomas of Britain composing his Anglo-Norman verses at the court of Henry II. The motif of plants growing from the graves of lovers and intertwining belongs to a stratum of storytelling that predates the written versions by an unknown span of years, appearing in traditions from different parts of the world that have had no contact with one another, suggesting that the image is doing something for human beings generally, offering a form of persistence after death that is not spiritual but botanical, slow, and entirely physical. The dead become part of the ground. The ground becomes part of something growing. The growing things find one another because the roots direct them toward one another. The love that was prevented from completing its natural course in life continues after life is over in a different medium, at a different pace, in the vocabulary of wood and root and season rather than the vocabulary of human feeling. It is a strange comfort, but then the tradition has always been built on strange comforts. The story of Tristan and Isolde has been told in so many versions, across so many centuries, in so many languages, that it has become something more than any single telling contains. The fragments and complete texts that survive are only the portion of it that was written down, and those written versions were themselves preceded by an oral tradition of uncertain length, a living transmission through the mouths of harpers and poets who moved between courts and carried the story with them, adjusting it as they went, giving different weight to different scenes depending on the hall they were performing in, the audience they were addressing, the season of the year, the particular mood of the evening. Barrow's 4,485 surviving lines are a fragment of what was once longer. Thomas of Britain's 8 surviving fragments amount to something under 4,000 lines of what was originally a much more complete text. Eilert von Obergay's Tristan is the earliest complete version in any language that has come down to us. and even it is a recording of something that was already, by the time he wrote it, old. Behind all of these written versions lies the Irish tale of Diarmid and Grina, the young warrior, the king's betrothed, who looks across the hall and makes her choice, the long flight through the dark hills of Ireland, with the king's men behind them. The structural parallel is precise enough that scholars have accepted a shared or borrowed narrative tradition underlying both stories, though which came first and in what direction the borrowing moved is a question the surviving evidence does not cleanly answer. The two traditions ran parallel for centuries, one in Ireland, one in Celtic Britain, like two rivers moving through the same landscape, fed by the same rain, shaped by the same underlying geology, without the two traditions quite meeting or quite acknowledging their common source. In the Irish version, as in the Tristan legend, the chase never really ends, Fiann Mac Cumhel, pursuing Diarmid and Rye across Ireland, is the same pursuit that Mark's court represents when it sends the four barons to watch the doors of the hall, the world's interest in enforcing its own order against the particular disorder that love makes when it does not align with what has been arranged. The two figures running are always, in some version of this story, ahead of the pursuit. The hills receive them. The dark opens for them. They are always just over the next ridge, moving through the night with the particular speed of people who have something to run toward, as well as something to run from. And the story keeps being told. This is perhaps the simplest thing to say about it, and the one most worth sitting with as the night deepens. The story kept being told after the manuscripts were completed, and the scribes set down their quills. It kept being told after the libraries changed, and the languages in which it had been written became languages that required scholars to read. It kept being told in the courts that came after, and the courts that came after those, passing through the hands of different poets and different readers, losing some details and accumulating others. The core of it, the potion, the pursuit, the forest, the sails, remaining recognizable across all the variations like a melody that can be transposed and elaborated and developed but remains, beneath everything, the same melody. The hermit Ogren writing his letter by lamplight in the forest, the sword placed between two sleeping people as a kind of argument, the sails in the harbor white in the morning light. The Tristan stone stands in a field in Cornwall, with its Latin inscription worn at the edges, Drestinus hic iacit, Cunomori filius. Here lies Drestinus, son of Cunomoris, and the stone has been tilting very slightly toward the ground for 15 centuries or more, the way all standing stones eventually begin to lean back toward the earth from which they were raised. The inscription connects the legendary name to a historical one, and the historical one to a specific field, and the specific field to a specific coastline where the sea can be heard on clear days from the place where the stone stands. The weather has worked at the letters without stopping. The letters are still legible. Whatever name the stone was raised to preserve, the stone has preserved it. The name Tristan in the tradition comes from Blanche Fleur, who was dying when she gave it. She gave her son the word for sorrow, and then the room went quiet, in that way it goes. Quiet, and the name passed from her into the air of the room, and from the air of the room into everything that came after. The name has traveled a great distance since that moment. Through Eilhart's Middle Low German verses, through the fragments of Thomas of Britain, copied in the courts of the Plantagenets, through Barrel's incomplete manuscript lying open in a French library, with its last line ending where the vellum was cut away, through the oral tradition that preceded all of these texts and kept moving alongside them, the name kept traveling. It has arrived here, in this telling, across a distance that can only be measured in centuries.